I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we continue to bring you updates and analysis of Ukraine's surprise attack on Russia's Kursk region. We report on the rise of war tourism and bring you new, important details about the missile that Russia fired at the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv last month.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday the 9th of August, 2 years and 172 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, reporter Lauren Shirreff, and our guest is Damien Spleeters, Director of Expeditionary Operations at the Conflict Armament Research Group. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Russia.
Ukrainian forces have continued their rapid advance into Kursk Oblast with what seems now to be a much larger force than had previously been assessed. We think it's now around 4 brigades worth of Ukrainian armour equipped with American Striker. These have been visually confirmed. American Striker, German Marder infantry fighting vehicles. No real word yet from Kyiv authorities, as you might expect, but in last night's address, President Zelensky hailed Ukraine's capture of what he said was 350 square kilometres of Russian territory, saying his forces had turned the table on the Kremlin and brought war to its land. Now, news is very sketchy. Most sources come from geolocation, mainly from the Institute for the Study of War, and also the Russian mill blogger community, who have been very active, very, very vocal, and as we say, a bit like the stop clock telling the correct time twice a day. Sometimes these folks are on the money, and if you take away the frothiness of it, you can try and see the wood for the trees thing. However, the Telegraph has also been able to confirm some reporting, which I'll mention a little bit later. Some news also has come from Abti Aladinov. He's the commander of the Chechen Akhmatdyt unit that's fighting for Russia. He posted a video yesterday in which he said Ukrainian forces had advanced around 10 kilometres into Kursk. It was seen as a rare admission of Russian weakness. I think he's being a bit on the lighter side there, saying 10 kilometres. But this guy, Aladinov, he's a close ally of the Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov. He's also an official in Russia's defence ministry. On his video, he said, the situation is not irreversible. Nothing supernatural happened. Yes, our people died. That's a fact. The enemy has entered several settlements. So odd, you don't often see this. He said his forces, the Chechen forces, were unable to stop the Ukrainian advance because Kyiv's troops had just bypassed key strongholds. A good military tactic. Don't apply strength to strength. Just go around it if you can. Isolate it, move on. However, the Russian mill blogger Yuri Kotenuk said that Chechen units in that area had fled after the Ukrainian attack. There does seem to be a bit of a war of words at the moment between certainly the mill blogger community. Not seen anything official from Russia against the Chechen units, but there is a suggestion that they didn't put up much of a fight. But as I say, news is very, very sketchy. Now, Kyiv appears to have bolstered its forces, sent in reinforcements, second echelon troops, as they'd be termed in military terms. They'd be there to replace those in front of them that were either exhausted or been depleted by enemy action. The Ukrainian forces also said to have been mining the main roads down which any counterattack from Russia would come, and increasing the number of air defence assets in the area. Russian mill bloggers said that a carefully coordinated electronic warfare jamming operation by Ukrainian forces had left Russian units unable to communicate, and other Russian sources warned that, quote, the scale of the crisis is expanding, end quote. They're saying Ukrainian units are moving at high speed, bypassing Russian fortifications and attempting to expand the bridgehead that they've managed to achieve in the last couple of days. It's difficult to get a very clear idea of how far Ukraine has advanced, but local residents were being evacuated from the town of Lugov. That's about 30 k's northeast of Koronovo. There's a video circulating on social media showing that. Now, that area, that's about 40 kilometres from the nearest border point with Ukraine. It's on the main east-west road that comes out of Ukraine and runs east-west into Kursk city itself. That area where the people are being evacuated from, there's no suggestion that there's armed action happening there at the moment, but have said they've beefed up security, although there's no indication at present that is one of the Ukrainian objectives. Footage from the Deep State analytical site, which is a usually reliable source, showed a destroyed Russian column of 15 military trucks about 20 kilometres west from Lvov on that road, on that east-west road, reportedly near the town of Rilsk. And the Telegraph has been able to confirm this. We've geolocated that ourselves. Oliver Carroll, foreign correspondent of The Economist, said many trucks had been hit, leaving scores of dead Russians. There is footage on social media. Just keep an eye out. What I've seen, it didn't have a graphic content warning before it started playing, so just be aware if you're looking around. There's some very graphic images of these trucks that have been hit. We think last night, a lot of dead people there. Judging by how the trucks have been hit, there's lots of small holes in the fabric of the roof. It looks like that may have been a cluster munition attack there. Now, Russian mill bloggers say Ukrainian forces have been seen 35 kilometres from the international border along the Sumy Oblast area. They've been seen in small groups that far ahead, and they are not immediately trying to hold territory, which suggests to me there'd be reconnaissance elements looking for routes and weaknesses and obstacles and that kind of thing. Rybar, one of the authoritative Russian military bloggers, wrote on Telegram, Ukrainian formations have already begun digging in at the achieved lines, introducing a second echelon. Now, Reuters reporting Yuri Podlyaka, who's a popular Ukrainian-born but pro-Russian military blogger. They're quoting Podlyaka as saying, Sudza, that's the nearest town across the border, Sudza is basically lost to us, and this is an important logistics hub. In general, the situation is difficult and continues to deteriorate, despite the fact that the pace of the Ukrainian offensive has noticeably dropped. End of quote from him. Now then, battlefield footage that again you can find on social media reportedly shows disabled Russian tanks, destroyed helicopters, damaged buildings, lots of dead soldiers. It is extremely difficult to try and either geolocate it or verify any of this. There's also footage allegedly showing Russian strikes on Ukrainian vehicles. And I'm sorry, there's going to be lots of allegedly and reportedly as we cover this, because, as I say, verifiable news is so hard to come by. Now, Russian jets were seen flying low over the area, no doubt to avoid their defences. And as we reported yesterday, there's more footage of that video showing dozens of Russian prisoners of war being marched away under armed guard by Ukrainian forces. Russia is thought to have called up its own special forces to stage a fight back before Ukraine gets a chance to dig in. Videos circulated by Russian social media accounts purported to show Wagner Group troops confirming they've been sent to secure and stabilise the Kursk region. A Ukrainian intelligence source speaking to The Economist said the Russians are making very stupid errors and it's all down to their corrupt top-down management which prioritises good news over the truth. The Kremlin has declared a federal emergency in the area and ordered residents of 4 towns to evacuate. As I mentioned one earlier on, people are being moved into temporary shelters. Putin has promised one-off payments of 10,000 rubles, that's about 90 quid, 114-ish US dollars. These payments to Kursk residents to assist with evacuations. They'll be thrilled with that. Now, Putin has convened another Security Council meeting for today. I've seen footage of it. It's happened in the last couple of hours. The last one was 2 days ago, you may remember, when General Gerasimov, the head of the Russian armed forces, said everything was under control. Now, Russian media reported today that issues of combating terrorism were discussed, and the FSB director, Alexander Bortnikov, made a report. Interestingly, Gerasimov was not there today. I mean, it can't be long before he gets sacked. In his nightly address yesterday, I quoted a little bit from earlier on, President Zelensky also said, Ukrainians know how to achieve their goals, and achieving the goals at war was not our choice. Russia brought the war to our land, and it should feel what it has done. His presidential advisor, Mikhailo Podolyak, said the incursion into Russia would strengthen Kyiv's hand in any future peace talks with Moscow, one of the suggested aims of the operation. Mr. Podolyak said, when you increase Russian losses, when you ramp up their war costs, such as destroyed military equipment, lost territory, lost people, will this affect how they perceive their war? Without a doubt. And then from Russia, in a very brief moment of lucidity, Dmitry Medvedev said that the Ukrainian attack was an attempt to force Russia to divert resources from the front and to show the West that Ukraine could still fight. A startling strategic insight there. He then reverted to type saying, as a result of the Kursk attack, Russia should expand its war aims to include taking all of Ukraine. He said, from this moment on, the special military operation should acquire an openly extraterritorial character. No, I've got no idea either. He went on, he said Russian forces should go to Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Kyiv, and beyond, he says. Oh, here we go. We will stop only when we consider it acceptable and profitable for ourselves. He's seemingly oblivious to the fact that Russia still hasn't taken Kyiv after 2.5 years of their lightning 3-week advance and not in control of the whole country. And just finally, Reuters are reporting that gas is still thought to be flowing through Sudza via the pipeline there. It carries about, nearly 15 billion cubic metres of gas last year, which is about half of Russia's gas exports to Europe. I'll talk about that line a little bit later as well. Now then, elsewhere, away from this incursion, let's go a bit further northeast into Russia, and an overnight drone strike against a military airbase in Russia's Lipetsk Oblast set off a chain explosion, detonating more than, we thought, high hundreds. Ukraine's put a figure of 700 bombs destroyed. That's very specific, but a lot of there was an enormous, great big bang. So the Lipetsk 2 airbase is about 150 k's northeast of the Kursk fighting, about 350 kilometres northeast of Kharkiv, to give you a rough area. This is a source in Ukraine's intelligence agency speaking to the Kyiv Independent. It's thought that glide bombs were kept at the site, which might have been the target, or might have been a secondary explosions. Now, Russian authorities had earlier said that a fire had broken out at the military airfield and an energy facility was damaged in a drone attack in the oblast. The source speaking to Kyiv Independent said there were fighter jets and helicopters at the Lipetsk 2 airbase. This is just on the western edge of the city of Lipetsk. It's about 500,000 people. It's quite a sizable city. It's unknown if any aircraft were damaged or destroyed. Videos you'll find on social media. I'm looking at various Russian Telegram channels, showed a massive explosion. Although, it's impossible really to verify from that. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces confirmed the attack on the airfield, but said the damage was still being clarified. Down south now, and Russia's defense ministry said that 75 Ukrainian drones had been intercepted overnight over 6 different oblasts, as well as occupied Crimea. The ministry also claimed that 7 naval drones in the Black Sea had been intercepted. Next, a source in the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, again speaking to Kyiv Independent, said that a first-person view drone operated by the agency had hit another Russian military helicopter in mid-air over Kursk Oblast. If so, this would be the second such incident in a week. Now, I've watched the video that they put out to accompany this news, provided by the source, and from the video, I'm not convinced the aircraft was hit by the drone. It looks to me as if the FPV flew underneath the tail rotor just as the feed cut out. Nevertheless, this could be a very interesting new tactic if drones are going for helicopters. I don't know if you've got the control to be able to direct it specifically into the tail rotor. As I said yesterday, that's very critical, that part. But basically, if anything, a drone hits any part of an aircraft, especially a helicopter in flight, it's probably not going to end well. I can assure you it would be very, very hard for a pilot to see a drone coming against a clear sky, especially with the closing speeds. If you're talking like 130, 140 knots, about 150 miles an hour-ish, you're just not going to see these things against the sky, let alone, I reckon it's virtually impossible to see a drone against ground clutter. So if you're looking down, if the drone is below you, and you've got all the trees and buildings, God knows what else, very, very difficult to see a drone coming at you. I don't think they'd be picked up either. Please tell me if you've got more knowledge on this than me, but I don't think a radar warning receiver would pick up something as small as an FPV drone either coming towards you. So I think this could be an interesting new tactic if it is such by Ukraine. Now then, on Ukraine's side, they said air defences shot down all 27 attack drones launched by Russia overnight. That comes from the Air Force. And then just in the last couple of hours, to bring you just up to speed here, David, footage on social media just in the last 2 hours shows a supermarket in Konstantinivka in flames after a Russian strike. The regional governor, Vadim Filashkin, said that artillery had killed 10 and injured 35. Those are the last numbers I've seen. President Zelensky said that search and rescue operations are ongoing, with some people still trapped under the rubble. A freight department of Nova Pochta, that's Ukraine's largest postal service, was also badly damaged in the strike. Injuries reported there. That was in the supermarket. Konstantinivka, you'll remember, it's regularly hit. It's right in the centre of the country. You may remember another Russian attack on a market in the town last September, killed 17 and injured over 30. So there's still a lot of activity in the Donbass, although we are necessarily focusing more on the north right now. And that's us up to speed, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for bringing us all of that news. I know that we've been talking a lot this morning, ferrying updates and news back and forth to verify everything and try and put it all together and bring it to you. Joe Barnes, you've been covering this story, this incursion into Kursk, over the past few days. Dom's brought us up to speed, brought us the news. What aspects of this story would you like to bring out and examine for our listeners?
Well, where do we start? It's been rather bonkers, but there's a few comparisons we can draw to other military operations that Ukraine has carried out in terms of the Russian response. So I remember Roland Oliphant and I, September 22, were, as you do, going through like Russian Telegram channels and checking out what's happening around the battlefront. And we noticed people complaining about build-ups of troops, the weak parts in defences from the Russian side. And then the Kharkiv counteroffensive happened. While what's happening in Kursk isn't as dramatic as that, it was, I think, 90 kilometres in a day in Kharkiv. Not so much in terms of advance here, but it's still very dramatic. And it's the same complaints. It's Russians complaining that areas aren't well manned. They're filled with lowly trained conscripts who aren't organised, who aren't communicating between one another. And as soon as the going gets tough, they just get running instead of the tough get going, or literally get going, I guess. So that's one thing that I've been looking at. The other is the sophistication that Ukraine has put into this. And it's clearly like what is coming out of this is clearly a planned operation. I'm sure we can all discuss why we think it's happening, what are the potential outcomes in a second. But what we've noticed is there was lots of shaping strikes around this region, whether it be drone strikes hitting telecommunications and infrastructure, things like that. The other thing, the electronic warfare thing, seems to be a really, really big element to this. We often hear that the Russians have an advantage when it comes to electronic warfare, especially in Donbass and Luhansk, on those front lines with blockers out there severing drone feeds, etc. But it looks like Ukraine has actually been able to generate its own electronic warfare force on this approach, on this incursion, where it's been able to basically scramble the communications between individual Russian units. And because they're poorly trained, they're not battle hardened, this is them then struggling to communicate. And that's what causes this disarray. And it's been really tricky for the Russians on that regard. And you can tell that from certain elements of the response. For instance, yesterday, Peace in Today's paper, it was online yesterday, we looked at whether the Russian Ministry of Defence had edited or tweaked a social media statement, and it emerged it had, where it basically said, there's a small reconnaissance and sabotage group of the Ukrainians. We beat and battered them, and they beat a hasty retreat. That then suddenly started disappearing when these Russian military bloggers, social media figures started saying, hang on, there's still Ukrainians around and they're actually making progress. You can't be doing this. So actually the Russian side are in a bit of disarray. Is Putin getting the actual information? I think he is now, because they've actually just declared a federal state of emergency for the Kursk region, which is really elevating it. Putin, I'm sure that you already know, has taken basically personal charge and put in one of the deputy prime ministers in charge of managing Kursk rather than the local authorities. You've got things like that. There is actually concern. And what we're seeing this morning is we've had this big strike on this convoy, which is clearly Russian reserves being brought in to try and stabilise the new front. He's trying to stage a fight back, put defences in. And each of those trucks, I think we can count about, if you look at the video, there's a morning video, which all shows a car driving past in daylight. If you're squeamish, should come with graphic content warning, as Dom said, bodies hanging out. But there's 14 of these trucks, and Ukraine, I think Nexter had done an analysis saying that each of those trucks could carry about 35 fully armed infantry soldiers. And they predicted that between 200 and 490 Russian soldiers could have been killed or wounded, which would mark one of the biggest losses in a single attack. And that's actually on Russian soil, 25 miles inside of Russian soil. So you've got the Russian military bloggers saying, it's HIMARS. Obviously, no comment. The Americans, they have their stance on HIMARS, and they're being very, we've told the Ukrainians they can use them, HIMARS on Russian territory if it's for defending Ukraine. But we see that as referring to protecting the Kharkiv, not on this new front. So yeah, interesting stuff. And I guess we can have a conversation of why we think Ukraine are doing it.
Let's kick that off, Joe. Do you want to go first? What are your initial thoughts on that?
Initial thoughts, I am still trying to actually come to a conclusion myself, but there are things that we're picking up. So in Sutska is one of the main gas terminals that pumps Russian natural gas into Europe. And it's probably the last gas terminal. It equates to about half of Russia, through the pipeline it attaches to, is about half of Russia's natural gas exports to Europe. Big revenue generator. If Ukraine was to capture that and destroy it, just keep it under its own control, it would then control a significant revenue generator for the Kremlin, which most of that tax money, as we know, gets thrown into the war chest for funding the invasion of Ukraine. Another more outlandish one that's been floated around the Russian military blogger community is that Ukraine isn't that far away from the Kursk nuclear power plant. Is it going to try and take the power plant and then basically trade it off for Zaporizhzhia? Because then they've got a like-for-like swap. Probably more outlandish because it's actually a long way to go. I think Ukraine, it's about an 80-kilometre march. So what's that? Just about 40 miles, well, more than 50, 60 miles to go until they reach that point. And then the other more obvious one is Ukraine likes to demonstrate to Russian civilians that their country is at war. And it's not just this special military operation. So by running amok and running a riot inside of Russia, they did it in Belgorod using anti-Kremlin Russians. Now they're actually using a full Ukrainian force to do it. They're showing Russians that the war has come to them. And Zelensky said exactly that. And maybe potentially Putin isn't the man to handle and look over them.
Joe, any other diplomatic or any other updates you'd like to bring us before we go to Lauren?
Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, all-powerful guy, has given an interview, Yurovsky Pravda outlet, and it's been picked up by Reuters. And he's basically said in an interview that a second Kyiv-led peace summit should not be treated as a start of negotiations with Russia. You'll remember back, earlier this year, there was a peace summit held by Ukraine in Switzerland, which got about 80 countries to sign a declaration committing to supporting peace on 3 out of 10 of Zelensky's 10-point peace plan that he had drawn up. And it's nuclear safety, it was withdrawing from Ukrainian territory and returning prisoners, mainly children. And we're under the working assumption that Ukraine wants to hold another one of these, potentially in the Middle East, towards the end of the year. November's being talked up. And most notably, the Ukrainians are saying, look, we want Russia to be part of this summit. We want them to attend. So this is what Yermak had to say. So it's possible for a Russian representative to attend the second summit to whom this plan could be handed over. One should not treat the second summit as the beginning of negotiations with Russia. Then he went on, we want this to happen, but there are conditions without which a second summit cannot take place. And that is referring to the drafting of a joint peace plan. So Russia has basically said, look, this summit that you held was a load of nonsense. It's nothing to do with us. But that was at a time when its forces were advancing through the Donbass, making not substantial ground, but making enough gains to make Ukraine's life quite uncomfortable. They'd be thinking about what they have to do to stop this. Maybe launch an incursion into Kursk is one of the ways of doing that. But now we've got this going on. We've got some serious strikes at the airfield today, 700 bombs being talked of. You could look at it in a different light then, how things swing like a pendulum. And the Ukrainians are definitely trying to regain the initiative at some point. So yeah, interesting to see that now Ukraine is really beating the drum to get Russia involved in these peace summits and basically say, look, we're not going to allow it to be a negotiation, but we want you to hear our demands because we keep on hearing Putin's maximalist demands elsewhere.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. As I said, we'll come back to Dom later to get your thoughts on this incursion into Kursk. But let's leave the battlefront for the moment and go to our reporter, Lauren Shirreff. Lauren, you've been looking at a completely different story in regards to Ukraine, that of war tourism. Could you just start by explaining what drew you to the story in the first place?
Hi, David. Yeah, so actually there was a report in a different newspaper by a foreign correspondent detailing how he discovered that there were people leading tours of Bucha, which is one of the worst affected towns in the Kyiv area, as I'm sure everyone listening will know. And I was really interested by that, to find out the scale of what was happening and who's going on these tours and how easy it is to go on if you really decide that you want to do that. So I looked into it, and there are, I think, about a dozen different companies offering these tours, and I'm sure probably more locally locally as well for people who are in Ukraine itself, and rather than just advertising online.
So why are people going to these places? What do they get from it? And how are they getting in? Who's organising it? Who have you been speaking to, Lauren?
Yes, I think what people are getting from it varies depending on who's visiting. It seems like some of this is coming around the dark tourism industry, which has grown up around Chernobyl over the last 10 years in Ukraine. And a lot of people go out of morbid interest in what's happened in Bucha and other places like it. But there's also people who want to go and see the destruction firsthand rather than just through what they've seen reported in the media. That's what one tour guide I spoke to told me, who offers tours from Kyiv and into the surrounding area. And in terms of how people are getting there, I would imagine that it's mixed, and I don't have the details of how everyone's travelling there. I did speak to Maria Romanenko, who is a tour guide living in Manchester now, as well as a journalist, who's planning to take a group to Lviv later this year. And the group that she's leading will get a bus to Poland, will fly to Poland, and then get a bus over the border. And I would imagine that a lot of that is going on. But I think it varies quite dramatically person to person. I did speak to one YouTuber who's made his own way to Ukraine just by driving, and I think people who are visiting from Central Europe might be doing that as well.
One day, Lauren, will tell the story of how Dom and I got in on our first trip to Kyiv. But what can you tell us about the people going? Where are they from, and what have they said about their experience?
So according to the guys that I spoke to, around half of them are American, which I understand is quite typical of people in the dark tourist demographic. But there are also a lot of Brits as well, and a lot of people from neighbouring countries who perhaps have a personal relationship with Ukraine. A lot of them find it quite harrowing, as you would imagine, and really feel moved by the resilience of people living in places like Bucha. And I think a lot of them are also interested to see the material evidence of the conflict that happened there in terms of different vehicles and weapons that have been left behind, and that's evidence of the destruction from a point of interest in examining that historical material firsthand. So I think there's been a real range of experience in terms of what I've heard from people, and a lot of them, or everyone that I spoke to really was really struck by how fantastic people in Ukraine are and how their response has been to everything they've gone through. That's probably the main takeaway.
I mean, that's the next question, isn't it? What's the Ukrainians' reaction to people coming to be tourists in places that were the scenes of horrific war crimes? What have they told you?
Those people that I spoke to understand why people are interested in visiting areas like this and understanding it for themselves. One person I spoke to explained being a little bit desensitized to the war and feeling if people are going to come and visit, then there's understanding of that. And especially he mentioned that a lot of the people who do visit, people from America and Britain, they live in countries where their governments are paying to support Ukraine, so they're paying for that with their taxes. So had a matter-of-fact attitude to it. When I spoke to Maria, the woman who's planning to take a group to Lviv, she did express concern around the fact that amateur documentarists on YouTube going to Bucha and interviewing people who've been through the horrific things that happened there. She was concerned that that might be a form of re-traumatization for those people, having to open up again and again about the things that they went through. And her main concern was that everyone leading tours like this are properly trained and that the industry is regulated, which she did also point out is difficult to do when the country that you're in has been at war for 2.5 years. So I think I would imagine that there's quite a mix among Ukrainians, and that's what I heard from the people I spoke to.
Absolutely. Lauren, what else would you like to tell us about your story here? What have we missed?
I think the most interesting thing that I found was that there are websites that appear to still be offering tours of Chernobyl and the surrounding town that was destroyed in the disaster in 1986, despite the fact that the government officially closed off the area when the war happened or not long after it, to my understanding. And some of them say you can sign up for a tour now, but we'll only really reopen it when the war is over. But the fact that that is a date that's completely uncertain and these things are still being advertised along with tours of Bucha and other areas close to the capital alongside it makes me wonder if there are still tours of Chernobyl happening and how much of that might be going around underground at the minute for those dark tourists that are still visiting Ukraine.
Thank you, Dom, Joe and Lauren. Yesterday, I spoke to Damien Spleeters, Director of Expeditionary Operations at the Conflict Armament Research Centre. We spoke about his organisation's most recent investigation into the missile that struck Ukraine's largest children's hospital on the 8th of July. Here is our conversation. Well, Damien, thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you again. Would you just remind our listeners about your work in the past 2 years?
Sure. Hi, David. Thank you for having me again. So, Conflict Armament Research is an organization that investigates the diversion of weapons and weapon components in conflicts around the world. We are sending investigators all around the world where there's a conflict. And we work there with national security forces to access whatever is being recovered. We open it up, we take detailed pictures, and then we work with the manufacturers, with the intermediaries to try to understand the chain of custody of that item and how it got where it's been used. So how it got diverted, by whom, and that's what we're trying to determine.
Your latest piece of work is looking at the missile that struck the children's hospital in Kyiv last month. What can you tell us about that missile? What have you found?
That's right. So we have been able to document remnants of that missile that struck the Kyiv hospital, I think on the 8th of July, so about a month ago. And what we've been able to see and to determine is that it is a Russian manufactured cruise missile. And that's been already determined, but we've been able to confirm that based on the remnants. But more than that, we've been able to date the production of the missile. And we've seen that it's been produced by Russia in the second quarter of 2024. So that's 12 weeks roughly, so 3 months before the attack, or as little as 8 days before the attack. This is a trend that we've seen with this very specific type of cruise missile before, used in Ukraine by Russia. We've seen this specific model before, and we've seen, based on the production number on the missile, that they were on average produced about 2 months before being used, which is very short.
Can you give us any insight into how you actually do that dating? How did you determine it was up to 3 months ago?
So most states that have an established military industry will have a need to mark the weapons that they produce and the ammunition they produce for various reasons, logistics mainly. And this is no different with this type of missile. So there's a 13-digit code. Each segment represents some information about the missile, where it's been made, the factory that made it, and especially important for us, when it's been made. So you have a part of the missile, you have 2 digits, one for the quarter and one for the year of production. Once you've been able to decipher that code, then you can determine the quarter of production of the weapon. And we've been able to double check and confirm our methodology to understand that code by looking at other components inside the missile and confirm that our assertion was correct.
And can you just spell out for us the significance of that finding, that, as you write in the notes I've got in front of me, that the missile was manufactured only weeks and potentially just days before the attacks? Why is that important?
It's important for us to determine that because it shows that Russia is in very much a hand-to-mouth type of production for highly important assets like air-delivered missiles, such as the one that we've documented there, which is in the long term very much unsustainable and very prone to disruption. So if there's a little disruption in the supply chain for parts of that missile, then it could end up having a lasting impact on Russia's ability to use this kind of assets.
Previously, when we've spoken, you've talked a lot about the use of Western components or sort of electronic chips and that sort of thing in missiles. Is that something you've observed in this case at all?
So there were no components available for the remnants of that missile. That usually is what happens when a missile functions correctly. So the strike, the detonation will destroy a large part of the missile. What remains usually is what is further away from the warhead, from the explosive part of the missile. And this is what we've been able to document in this case.
Does this tell us much about the effectiveness of international sanctions against the Russian Federation from what you found in this case?
I think this is something that needs to be taken into consideration when measuring the effectiveness of export control and sanctions, especially knowing how Russia likes to posture itself and its military as unaffected by such export control and sanctions. Well, when you are able to determine that for more than a year now, almost, they've been living hand to mouth in the production of highly important cruise missiles, that is a factor to take into consideration when measuring the effectiveness of such export control and sanctions.
You and your teams look at a number of weapon systems, missiles, drones, etc. Are there any patterns or discoveries that you've made in the past few months that you think are important for people everywhere to understand?
Yes, I think it's important also to understand that Russia has been stockpiling. In some cases, they're still going through those stockpiles. So when we see components made before the invasion, 2022, 2021, we understand that it's going to take a while for sanctions and export control to be effective against the use of those components by Russia, because they will still have to go through those stockpiles first. So export control sanctions take a long time to be effective, and it's difficult to measure their effectiveness. But the fact that we've seen that missile and determined its date of production is one of the ways to do that.
Just taking you back to something you said earlier, when you say remnants of the missile that you looked at, could you just spell out exactly what you mean? Because you say that the electronic components are destroyed because it's obviously exploded. So what exactly are we looking at, and how do you know that's what you're looking at?
We're looking at pieces of the airframe. We're looking at the engine, part of the tail. And we have been able to confirm the model of the missile because of the production mark. That is exactly the same as the ones that we have found previously on that type of missile.
Damien, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention at this point?
Talking about components in general, I think the work we've been doing has shown that a lot of focus has been going on manufacturers. And that's also part of the things I wish the general public would understand a bit better in terms of export control and sanctions. Like I said, it takes a while for them to be effective, but also the focus should be sometimes more also on distributors. So there's a natural funnel happening in the semiconductor industry where, as conflict armament research, we've been able to identify more than 250 manufacturers based only on logos on chips. But you have much fewer distributors. And so there's a natural funnel happening there. Those distributors will have a better visibility and control over the supply chain of components going downstream. And so I think it's very important to also work with them in order to identify the other entities down the chain, the local distributors or the intended end users that are much closer to the diversion itself. And that's key to try to solve that problem of diversion. Another thing that we've been able to determine since we talked last time, and I don't know if we discussed that already, but this kind of collaborative approach with industry has also allowed us to identify problematic entities before they even are able to buy something. So the fact that we've identified certain components with certain manufacturers constitutes for them a red flag. So they know that now when they have a new customer trying to acquire this type of component, it may be a red flag in itself. And so they contact us and we try to work with them to see if those entities are entities of concern. And working that way, we've been able to identify entities that were problematic. And so I think that's a way to go beyond this cat and mouse game that people think about when they think about sanctions. And people refer always to that expression that I'd like to delete from the English language, whack-a-mole game, right? When you have a mole popping up and you have to whack it. I'd like that expression to disappear, because when people use it, usually they use it in the sense that they want to say that it's useless, that what you're doing to stem the flow of components is not going to work, that another company will take its place, and that whatever you do, Russia will be able to acquire those components. What we are trying to show with the work that we do is that it is possible to stop them, it's possible to stem that flow, and it's even possible to identify those bad actors before they buy something. But that requires a lot of collaboration, and on the part of industry, a lot of trust, because you're sticking your neck out, you're trying something new, you don't know if it's going to work. Your experience as an industry member, an industry actor, has been that tracing is impossible. There's too many different customers, too many different distributors. And then conflict armament research comes along and we show you that actually in that long list of distributors, we can identify for you the one that's problematic. And I think for those who have trusted us, it resulted in very, very positive results.
Without wanting to be too crass and crude with this, the process you've just described, does it look something like a distributor based in a Western country comes to you and says, we've had interest in one of our products which has a certain microchip, for example. They're based in a certain country in Asia, and we're not sure about them. We're not sure why these people might want 1,000 fridges or cars or whatever. What do you think? And then you say, look, I'm not sure about them. We're not sure about their background. They have links with the Russian state or something, so maybe they're not the right people to be exporting your goods to. Is that roughly what you're talking about?
That's roughly what happens.
Okay.
Only two different things. A lot of these industry actors use automatized screening tools. And so we have seen that those automatized screening tools are not always getting the right response. And so working with us who have a very targeted approach based on evidence gathered in the field fills some of the gap that those big tools cannot fill. So that's been one feedback. And also you mentioned fridges and cars, and that's also another myth that we have to bust, is that so far we have seen no evidence of Russia buying washing machines and fridges to just take out the chips and put them in missiles. I don't think that's what's happening.
Thank you so much, Damien. Coming up, we hear Dom and Joe's final thoughts. Dom, Joe earlier gave his take and his initial thinking around the reasons behind this incursion into Kursk. Can you take us into your thinking, Dom Nicholls?
Yeah, so this is doing the rounds. What's the incursion all about, and what are their objectives, and what are they trying to get out of it, and all that kind of stuff. I note that our friend and colleague over at The Economist, Shashank Joshi, is asking today on Twitter, he's saying, well, they've got to define, or be helpful. They don't have to, of course, Ukrainians don't have to do anything they don't want to do, but if you don't define success, he's saying that literally anything could be painted as success or failure. So, of course, I mean, we've been talking about it for a couple of days now. I don't want to get too specific because we simply don't know. And I don't want to stray too far into armchair general territory. I wasn't a general, I was a colonel, but I do like an armchair. So I'll have a go. But I'm looking at what possible objectives are there. And we've touched on all these, and Joe mentioned many of them earlier on. Is this just an effort to bolster morale? Is it a grab for Russian prisoners to be used in future prisoner exchanges? Are they going to try and do something for the Kursk nuclear power plant? Do they want to exploit the gas line through Sudza, as Joe mentioned? Is it just a mission rehearsal? I mean, you've got all the training you can do for combined arms manoeuvre with tanks and infantry and engineers and all the rest of it. That's great, but you've got to eventually throw it into the mix. And as we saw with the counter-offensive last year, if the first time you roll that out is into the maw of a very well-prepared enemy position, it's extremely hard to prevail. So maybe this was a limited mission rehearsal operation. Is it to draw reserves from Russia, or maybe forces out of the Donbass, or is it a future land grab, a land grab for future negotiations? There are other possibilities as well. Now, for my money, I don't think this is just about morale. I think it's too risky just to try and do this to bolster the domestic and international support. I also don't think they're going for the Kursk nuclear power plant. I think that's just the resources needed to do that, to hold on to it. And if anything goes wrong, then they'd be responsible, and so on and so forth. So I think those are probably beyond scope here. The gas line, yeah, maybe that might well be a secondary objective. I don't think that would be the whole point of this. It does seem a little bit, I keep saying, is the juice worth the squeeze? I don't think the gas line itself would be a major objective. Prisoners, again, I don't think that would be a primary objective. It's unlikely to be an end in and of itself. You're going to get prisoners through other military activities, so I don't think that's a primary driver. And the scale of this is unlikely to draw in Russian forces from the Donbass. So I'm thinking, is it a mission rehearsal or a land grab? It might be both. It might be possible to exploit Russian weakness. So what might start out as a mission rehearsal, if it goes well, it could extend into a land grab. But I'm leaning more towards this being a land grab. Let's have a look at the geography. The border here in this area, in this little bit of northeast Ukraine, the border with Russia runs very roughly northwest to southeast, except for a fairly neat chunk, not square, but really quite nicely rectangular, that sticks out into Ukraine. Now, the line northwest from Sudza, which is a town just over the border that seems to be well under Ukrainian control at the moment, a line northwest from Sudza through Koronevo, which we also think is in Ukrainian hands, and onwards through Rilsk, which is where that convoy was destroyed last night. That line seems to be the main thrust at the moment. And if you push a line up that way, push troops up that way, that would straighten the border. Now, the problem when you try and punch into an enemy line is that you have exposed flanks and extended lines of resupply. You've got to send fuel, ammunition, water, all the rest of it over great distances if you've got a big sudden armoured thrust into the enemy, and very exposed flanks, very exposed sides. But if Ukraine bites off this rectangular chunk of land, it is open country. It's very good for manoeuvre. They're already beyond the only real major water obstacle in the area. So if they take off that chunk of land and effectively straighten the border between Russia and Ukraine, that means that any resupply would be on interior lines. They wouldn't be as molested potentially by Russia if they didn't have a big finger sticking out into Russian territory. They'd be working on interior lines, and their flanks would be protected because they've got Ukraine on the left and the right. So I wonder if there's all an effort to try and straighten that border through some very favourable ground for manoeuvre and armoured warfare. It's dry at the moment, it's the middle of summer. I wonder if that's what it's about. And then dig in and hang on for as long as they can. Now, what would be the indicators of this? What should we be looking out for over the weekend to try and bottom some of this out? Initially, I said a couple of days ago, I thought there were two axes of advance, one to the north and one to the northeast. Now, the northern one seems to be the axis that has extended most. And it might be because they've just been bypassing areas of Russian strength, but it might be that that's the main effort. Now, that northern line, which is now going in a kind of northwesterly direction, if that continues to be exploited, that could indicate that this is a land grab, that Ukraine are putting into practice a kind of Trump-proofing policy, anticipating future negotiations. So at the moment, that's what I think it's going to be. That seems to be where they are consolidating. I mean, it's very, very sketchy. As I said at the beginning, very difficult to get information out here. But of all the various possibilities, that for me is looking the least risky in an operation of huge risk, obviously. So keep an eye out for where they try and exploit, where Ukraine exploits, where they back the success that they have, where they choose to put their forces. They're very slim, very, very vulnerable, very, very protected forces. They don't want to use these things up lightly. However, I'll just leave you with a thought from freelance journalist Ewan MacDonald. He says that not knowing the goals of the operation is in itself a success for Ukraine. Just keeping everyone guessing, us, the Russians, the international community. I mean, this is all, as we said yesterday with Hamish DBG, this is all into surprise and deception. So I don't know if we'll ever know exactly what it was all about until the thing's well and truly over. But for now, that's what I'm leaning more towards, but keeping a very, very open mind, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Joe Barnes, would you like the very final words this week?
The point about keeping Russia, keeping everyone else guessing is important, because if you look at what happened before Ukraine's what has now become known as a failed counteroffensive of last summer, we basically knew exactly what was going to happen before it happened. We knew that they were going to try and make this thrust south, splitting Russia's forces in between the south and the east, and there was basically no operational secrecy about this. However, apart from the few Russians who were complaining about these odd troop build-ups in the Sumy region, and they've actually been complaining about one in Kharkiv, but we've not seen any results of that at the moment. No one was speaking about this, and it just came out of the blue. And one of the grand successes of this is it shows that Ukraine can do a bit of combined armour warfare, screaming and herring across Russian fields and stuff like that, down Russian roads, bypassing fortifications, fighting clever, and it just stows a bit of chaos. And that's, Dom will be better at describing it, but yeah, the whole point of coming in with a crash bang and wallop is you completely take your enemy by surprise and you leave them on the back foot, and that's what Ukraine doing now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.